ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Today, it's our series of the best conversations of 2024, and this time it's the story of Bhawani O'Brien. Dr. Bhawani O'Brien is a doctor born of Sri Lankan parents, who grew up in Malaysia, was trained as a doctor in the UK and Ireland, who then settled with her family in WA after she fell in love with the place. Then after years working as a GP in Bunbury and in Perth, Bhawani was feeling a little bit jaded. And then she found a pamphlet in her pigeonhole at work. The pamphlet was about voluntary assisted dying, a scheme that had recently been introduced to WA. And Bhawani realised she'd always been interested in death and all the things left unsaid and ungrieved for. And so she stepped into the world of becoming a voluntary assisted dying practitioner. And since then she's helped more than 100 people in their dying moments. Hi, Bhawani.
Hello.
Where does your name come from? What does it mean?
So the Tamil meaning for Bhawani is giver of life.
Oh, that's lovely. Considering what you do, do you think that's appropriate or ironic, or what do you think of that?
I'm not sure, actually. I mean, it feels like I should have been an obstetrician, but, you know.
Like I said, your parents were Sri Lankan. How did they end up settling in Ipoh?
My parents were actually born in Malaysia. Both their parents, my grandparents, came to Malaysia from Ceylon at the time in the late 1800s when we were a colony. Lots of Tamils came over then for a better life. And they helped set up hospitals and banks and railways, especially. So both sets of grandparents came over then. So both my parents were born in Malaysia. Sadly, my father especially always wanted to go back to Jaffna to see where his ancestry was from. But, you know, in his lifetime, the war was on, so he never quite made it there. So they were born in Malaysia and they met actually in Singapore medical school. They were both doctors as well. So both sides were Hindus.
Was their childhood quite different from yours?
Yes, tremendously different. My father was one of 6 and grew up in a tiny, tiny 2-bedroom council house in Malaysia. And my mother was one of 7. They were a little bit better off than my father's family. But, you know, both sets of grandparents came over and started from scratch. So my paternal grandfather was a clerk in a bank and my maternal grandfather was a station master, which was seen as quite a good job then. So they were better off. But they really, I mean, we used to laugh at this when my dad used to talk about it because we were kids, but he really did walk to school with no shoes on and go across the fields on a Sunday to collect eggs from a cafe owner, bartering things. And his job was to collect 7 eggs and bring them back unbroken. So yes, they had a very, very different childhood to us. And I think at that time, a lot of our parents just wanted better for us. And a lot of South Asian people would relate to this, is that we were brought up to really aspire to be doctors, lawyers, accountants, pharmacists in that realm.
And was that put in front of you? Was that put right in front of you?
Absolutely. It was, it was a spoken thing. It wasn't unspoken.
And you are a doctor. Was that?
I was a doctor. Yes, I was. I always wanted to be a doctor because I absolutely adored my father, and I used to play with a stethoscope when I was a child, and I decided that I wanted to be just like him. So I was lucky. I'm not sure if I always had I was quite slow on the uptake as a child and I wasn't bright. I wasn't instinctively bright. It took me a while to get there, at least secondary school. But it was hard for kids who weren't academic, although we were given everything materially because our parents had done well. They'd never had holidays. They worked really hard. My dad was an anaesthetist. My mum was a eye surgeon. But the understanding was that you do need to achieve this. The phrase that was always used was that you will come up in the world. Because, of course, being, as you can see, I'm a little brown woman, so I have more to overcome than just poverty.
Yes, particularly in Malaysia. Malaysia is a multicultural society, but it has those, for a long while, it's had those Bumiputra laws which favour the Malay peoples,
That's right.
as opposed to the Chinese or the Indian or
right.
Indian. Where did you fit into that hierarchy, and what were your prospects given your family heritage?
I think, primary school, we were oblivious to that, really. I think the quota system came in after, I think it was 13th of May, 1969. There was a terrible day that my father used to talk to me about. It was a state of emergency, basically, in Malaysia.
The terrible race riots, weren't there?
Absolutely, yeah. And so my parents, being junior doctors at the time, had to go in and help in emergency. And, the weapons used were household weapons, so the injuries were fairly spectacular. And after that, the quota system was brought in for things like university entrances. It would be the Bumiputras, which means son of the land. So it would be the Malaysians who got to go to 90% of the places.
And what did your dad think of that?
My dad was such a calm person most of the time. As I got older, we were all given the choice, all three of us, me and my brothers. We were told at some stage, I remember having my hair cut and my mother sitting beside me. So I must have been about 11 maybe. And she talked to me about, how things are in Malaysia. And you have the choice that Papa and I spend all our money educating you abroad, because if you stay here, you won't probably not get the choice to do what you want to do.
So they always imagined you'd migrate, you'd leave Malaysia.
Yeah. I think a lot of people in their situation hoped that their children would come back then, but some did and some didn't. But I can't imagine the decision that they had to make, would have been easy. And a lot of people emigrated. As you know, a lot of Australians are Malaysians who've emigrated from Malay and Chinese backgrounds. So we were all given the choice and we picked going abroad to study.
So you were sent to boarding school at the age of 13 in England. How did you feel about that at the time, Bhawani?
I absolutely loved it.
You see, that's a new thing on this program. I don't know anyone who's come on this program who says, I loved going to boarding school in the UK. They normally with this, the food was terrible, it was cold and wet.
I didn't really mind the food being terrible because, it was all new to me. As I said before, I was not a very bright student in primary school, and I had a lot of pressure from my mother especially. She was a high achiever. She expected results. My father was a lot more patient. My mother and I had a very, very difficult relationship. My older brother was a bright star, so that didn't help, although I'm so thankful I never held it against him, But it was the constant comparison of, Shri's bright, Bhawani's not that bright.
But you thrived.
I thrived because I didn't have that pressure anymore, I think, I think when they said to me, well, do your common entrance, my mum said to me, you don't worry if you don't get in, because I hadn't been really performing that well. And lots of us had extra tuition. And anyway, I did get in because I've realized that when I really want something, I can actually do it. And I'd also fallen into reading Enid Blyton's when I did start to read late. So my mother, being, thrilled that her daughter could actually read and liked books, bought me the whole Enid Blyton series. And I loved Mallory Towers and St. Clair's. And I was so lucky because I went to a fantastic school.
And was there lashings of ginger beer and dogs called Spot?
We had midnight feasts where we'd have things we didn't have day to day, lots of different little crackers with squeezy cheese on it and, lots of sweeties. And as we got a bit older, my house mistress would get McDonald's in for us. But I made lots of sister friends who are still my friends, who are sisters, really. I have two brothers who I love, but I never had sisters. So these friends, I've just been in the UK recently to talk about that. And when I'm with these friends, I feel true belonging. We grew up together.
So you went to Ireland then to study medicine.
Yes.
And that's when you met the first great love of your life. Tell me about this guy.
I did, yeah. My first love was in Ireland. So my brother and I both ended up in Ireland because my parents had both done postgraduate studies in England and Ireland. And my father, I think, encouraged him to go to Ireland because, it was in the 60s. My father was studying and he still remembers signs in England with no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. And he said, well, go to Ireland, you're less likely to encounter that. And he was right. So Shri went and I went 2 years later because I saw what fun he was having. And for the first time in my life, I think I actually thought, wow, I'm actually quite attractive to the opposite sex. Because, I'd never really felt that before. I mean, boarding school's fairly protected, especially in England. And yes, I met my first love within the first week of uni. We were at lectures, supposed to be concentrating, the old-fashioned lecture studios, and someone tapped me on the back and gave me a little note that said, "Will you go to the pub crawl with me?"
That's as romantic as it gets in Ireland, I think, isn't it?
It is.
Have a pint of
Well,
Guinness.
especially because I didn't know which one he was.
Oh, right.
Yes. And I had to say to my friend sitting next to me, "Which one's Dan?" And she looked up and said, "I think it's that one with the red jumper on," because it was just the first few days of college,
And what was Dan like?
Dan was wonderful. He was full of life. He was a rugby player and very, very bright, what we call a rugger-bugger, And we got together that first week. And I think a lot of the time for the 4 years we were together, we would split up at the summers because we'd think, well, we're still young. And I'm sure his parents were relieved at that as well. But there was something amazing about our relationship where it was that feeling of, I'd walk into the pub and in those days, the Swan, our pub would be packed, absolutely packed. And he'd be right at the end. And I'd look over and just feel that total feeling of completion. And we might not actually meet each other for an hour because we'd be chatting to everyone. It was a university pub.
But it was always going to happen at some point.
I think it was always going to happen.
Yeah.
And we grew up together because I was 18, he was 17, he was young, he was very bright. And we grew up together. We changed over the 4 years and became mature. And we had this amazing group of friends with us as well that we all grew up together.
And what became of him?
So Dan was 21 and he played a big game of rugby on, I think it was a Friday, and we'd all gone to watch and we'd ended up in the pub that night, as we always did. And we'd had a few drinks, well, probably more than a few being Ireland. And he had said, I think but the only clue I had was he said, "I'm quite tired, shall we just go?" Which was unusual because normally a session would be until about 11 or 12. And often because it was a rugby pub, our local College of Surgeons pub, Sean would let us have a lock-in, especially if the game was won. So we went home, we stopped at a Chinese and had a meal and went back to mine. And he always had to be home, Dan, because he had two very much younger siblings, and his mum always said to him, "Whatever you do, you need to wake up in your own bed because it's a good example." So I remember him rushing off for a taxi at about 3 or 4 in the morning. And thankfully, the last things we said to each other was, "I love you." So the next morning, I was living in this flat, really old, beautiful building, actually, in Palmerston Park, and with one of my best friends, Juggy. And he and I woke up and we were having our morning coffee and talking about the night before and about what had happened and where he'd ended up, because we'd often start the night together and he'd disappear off. And the doorbell went, and it was Dan's brother. And I remember in my head, it just didn't compute because he'd never come to our place before. So when he came in, we learned that they had gone in to get Dan up. I think he was meant to go to a christening, but he had died. So he'd woken up, he'd gone downstairs and talked to his mum, which was wonderful because his two favourite people in the world were his mum and his younger sister, which I think was one of the attractions, was that he loved women. He had huge respect for his mum. So he spoke to her and he went back to bed, and he was just, I think at the time, lying on his front, reading the papers on the floor as he used to sometimes. And they found him like that.
He'd had a heart attack?
No, obviously that was the presumption at the time. He had a postmortem, etc. And, it was a very difficult time because I was 22 and I was not part of that family. They were wonderful people, but I was so aware that I couldn't encroach on. So I didn't ask a lot of questions, but I think what happened, what was presumed was that it was a conduction issue with his heart. And I don't know if you've heard of a thing called sudden adult death. And it often happens to athletes. And it's one of the reasons why in UK especially, and I think in Ireland they do it now, is that they have defibrillators on playing fields.
Here too.
Yeah. So, it's called QT syndrome. It's called sudden adult death. In England, the charity that raises money for it is called cardiac risk in the young. So it's sudden death in a young person.
When an older person dies, it's often sad, but it's not tragic. When a young person dies at the age of 21, it feels like there's a real hole in the world all of a sudden. How did it feel for you?
Oh, I think it is one of the most broken parts of my life, and it takes years to get over that. And I think the suddenness of it as well. 1 minute the person's there, and the next they're not. And for me, it was a lot of things. Apart from my grandmother, I'd not really had to lose someone. And then it was a Catholic funeral. And so I come from a Hindu religion where grief is very vocal and very loud, and it's not the same. So yes, I don't know. It took me years and years. I barely survived it, Richard. I think it added to one of my, what's the Japanese thing about the cracks in pottery, kintsugi? It's one of my big cracks.
As a young medical student, you were sent to Kenya as an elective. What were you going to do there? What was your role in Kenya?
Well, we did the overseas elective scheme in my university. And what we did for that year was we raised money for our flights and our stay in countries, third world countries. So I picked Kenya because I'd never been to Africa and I really wanted to go there. And it was the summer before Dan died, actually. So it was, I guess, my first interaction or my first exposure to death in children, in young people. But obviously I didn't have a strong connection to these people. We worked in a small district hospital in Kapenguria, which was an 11-hour bus trip from Nairobi.
Good God.
Yes, it took huge bladder control, 11 hours, because we were told, I was traveling with a girlfriend from uni and we were told, do not get off that bus regardless. And I swear, thankfully
hours?
I hadn't had children then. My bladder was a lot stronger, but, 11 hours, yes. But we got there and we had lots of other medical students from Cork University, Galway University, and we became a little family for the 6 or 8 weeks, really. But it was hard going. We brought things like Panadol and Nurofen from the countries we came from because people were dying and having 2 Panadol a day. There was just nothing. There was nothing there.
What's the attitude to death and dying in such a place? It's more like medieval Europe, I suppose,
it's really much more part of life and death. I remember a young mother walking for 2 days with her toddler, and she was breastfeeding a baby. She walked for 2 days, and the toddler came in severely dehydrated, very ill, and eventually passed away 2 days later. And she just wiped her eyes and she didn't have much with her and walked home, And that was, it was very in your face. It was very much part of, it was just so accepted because they had to accept it,
Modern medicine creates a different kind of society, doesn't it? Where sudden death, like of your boyfriend Dan, is a deeply shocking thing, not so shocking in rural Kenya at the time. It must lead to a whole different way of living life and seeing life and death.
Yes, I think they had a much more live for the day outlook.
What did that experience in Kenya teach you about yourself as a doctor? Could you bear it? Could you bear up under all that loss and grief?
I learned then that I didn't take it on. And I think as a doctor, you can't afford to do that. You can't fall apart at every death you come across because you can't be a doctor without death.
What does that mean? Does that mean you have to hold that feeling at bay, or do you just let it quickly pass through you?
I let it pass through me. I can't speak for everyone else. Go away and gather your thoughts and maybe have a few tears for the person. But
the next patient needs you.
You can't, And I think, real grief is the people that you lose and you never stop thinking about. And that little child, I can't remember the child's name. So I feel I don't have the right to carry that grief. Whereas with Dan, you can hear the emotion in my voice. It's nearly 30 years on.
Then your third brush with death and grief came when you were an intern at a hospital in Scotland. This was March 1996, and this is really quite a strange story. What department were you working in at the hospital at the time?
I was working in the emergency department in Stirling. We used to do night shifts of a week of nights from, I think it was 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., and then we'd have the whole week off the next week, and it was my week off. But We used to have this phone in a different room that the paramedics had direct access to, so they never got held up with that phone. We used to call it the budgie phone because it had a specific ring that sounded like a budgie and really loud. And that phone was used if there was an emergency situation or a bad motor vehicle accident with multiple casualties. So it went off very rarely in a small district hospital. And it went off that morning. I think initially the news was there's been an incident at a small primary school just outside of Stirling in an area called Dunblane. There was vagueness about what had actually happened. They would sort of say, we expect multiple casualties, we're not sure yet. And eventually, anyway, it turned out horrendously that, I'm not going to say his name, but he had gone in and shot, I think it was 22, including the teacher.
Yes, 16 children were dead.
Yeah, and they were infant schools, so it was like 4 and 5-year-olds.
This is the Dunblane gun massacre. I think it might have been the worst gun massacre in British history.
I think it was, yeah, because it certainly was the first one that had happened. He had been aiming for assembly, which was in the gym. So he had missed a bus and he'd caught the PE class that had gone on there. So my colleagues had to go out there and do the horrendous, I don't know how they did it, but it was in an emergency like that, it was prioritizing who got the first ambulance in, which child, and moving children who hadn't survived into a separate room. And I do remember how it brought out the most amazing things about humans, though. We had a call from an emergency department in Boston saying, we understand that this has happened for you. We just wanted you to know that we're used to this. Could we in any way come over and take over your department for a day so that you could all have a day together? Of course, it was too difficult to organize from a logistics point, but you saw real humanity there. But Dunblane was also a school where lots of doctors sent their children. So lots of my colleagues who weren't in emergency medicine at the time, we had colleagues running downstairs to see if their children were there.
You eventually chose to become a GP and settled in Ireland and got married there in a country area. Why did you want to be a rural GP in particular?
It wasn't really out of choice. I did all my house jobs in Scotland and then met my husband and we went back to Dublin because that's where his family were. And we got married and it was the time of the Celtic Tiger and it was incredibly expensive. My 2 daughters were born there and in that time I did a few locum GP jobs before they came along. And it was in tiny towns, Edenderry and Trim, the little country towns. And I loved it. You know, you worked from the front room of a GP, giving him probably, I hope, a very precious week or so off. So you would live in the family house and you'd have his housekeeper and his receptionist would come in every morning and we'd call patients. It was very Doc Martin, very Doc Martin.
It was like that?
Yeah,
right.
It was so like Doc Martin.
I was going to ask that, but
it was so like Doc
that.
Martin. And,
right.
you know, it was hysterically funny at times because the Irish have a way of, they're never quite called by their actual name. So I'd go out and call Margaret. Go, Margaret? Nobody would look up and the receptionist would come out and go, no, she's known as Peggy.
Right.
And I go, oh, Peggy. And she'd go, oh, sure, I'm here. You know, and in she'd come. You know,
the Irish will never let you keep your name. I read a story about a guy who got a job at an office in Ireland whose name was, unfortunately, Wayne Bruce.
Yeah.
And he was given the nickname Man Bat after that, and it stuck with him for the rest of his life. That's how it goes.
Absolutely, yeah. But it was such a great experience because I'd be welcomed into the community and I'd often eat at the local pub or something and you get a consult over the table or they'd knock on the door at 10 p.m. and go, could you have a look at my child, please? You know, got a bit of a cough, you know.
So that sounds like a pretty good life. How on earth did you then end up in Australia and in WA in particular?
So I wanted to do my registrar year for GP training. So you had to do lots of different jobs, which I'd done in Scotland. And because Ireland's so small and I wasn't an Irish citizen yet, so I didn't really have a choice of doing it there. So I said, I want to go into Australia and New Zealand because I've always been intrigued by those places. So I came home for a bit and my dad and my brothers and I had a lovely trip to India. And then, so I'd done a lot of saving up at that time because it was just me, no kids. And I backpacked through Australia and New Zealand. Some places I stayed with friends because a lot of the Irish had come out here to work. And I loved Perth especially. I just loved the Mediterranean climate. And I woke up at my friend's house the first morning and she'd gone off to do her psychiatric registrar job in Fremantle, and she'd left me instructions on this is how you get to the city by train and this is how you get to the ocean. And I'd just come from Dublin and Birmingham and I thought, well, city, ocean, it's not going to be anything phenomenal really. I thought, well, I'll give it, I feel like a walk. I'll walk out there. And it was November. And I remember walking up and just coming across Cottesloe Beach and absolutely just feeling blown away by the beauty of it. It was 10:30, 11. There was 3 people on the sand and that greeny water and the sunshine. And I just
the
thought,
hot white light you get in WA.
Oh my God, the light is so different. Yes.
It's blazing.
Yeah. And I fell in love with it. And I travelled then. I did Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and I wanted to do all my adrenaline stuff. I did my deep sea diving course in the Barrier Reef. I did my bungee jumping in Queenstown. I did my whitewater rafting. So I was on a real nothing can kill me streak, which was sort of, it was good because I'd ring my dad from a payphone and go, I just jumped out of a plane at 10,000 feet over Lake Taupo, Papa. And he'd go, tell me about it. And my mum would be in the background going, oh my God, she's mad. She should be working. It was the real Asian way, the South Asian. Why is she not working? We don't take 6 months off,
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Feidler.
So you were saying how you arrived in Australia, loved WA, and eventually settled here with your family. And a couple of years ago, your father died in Malaysia. Did you get to say goodbye to him in person?
No, I didn't. I think, that was sort of one of the big, after Dan probably, again, really broke me. So it was the time of COVID, and part of being in Perth for me was my parents were getting older. They'd made it quite clear in no uncertain terms that they were remaining in Malaysia. They had a lovely house and they were not going to be moving to where I was or my brother's was. My younger brother, thankfully, ended up back in Malaysia, about 2 hours away from them. So, I'd been able to fly back to Malaysia quite a lot, and I used to do trips with my family and then take the kids home separately so that they could have time with their grandparents. And I never envisaged that I wouldn't be able to be there, when it was really necessary. But of course, COVID surprised all of us. My mother, had a very quick decline into dementia a few years before that. And my parents were different from the point that in their generation for South Asians, and a lot of my South Asian family friends will relate to this, is that they had a love marriage. They didn't have an arranged marriage. And they really loved each other, So when my mother started declining, my father kind of lost the will, really, to look after himself. So he was diabetic and, he just didn't take care of himself. And so his decline really came generally in the few months leading up to his death. And my younger brother, he'd travel to Ipoh from KL, Kuala Lumpur, and help a lot at home. I mean, my parents were very lucky. Well, they worked very hard, but they were very lucky to have help in Malaysia, so they were able to remain at home. But my father always said he wanted to die at home. He didn't want to die in a hospital. He was... So my younger brother, Anand, managed to get him home for his last few days and put a hospital bed in his room. And my mum, who was then being nursed, and she was very much catatonic dementia by then, and she really didn't know much of what was happening. So Anand made sure that she was moved back into their bed so that my dad could see her. So he had a lovely last day from what our carer told us, that he spent a lot of that day looking around out the window and at my mum, and he couldn't quite speak. And Anand is not medical. And, I think probably didn't recognize that this was coming up to the end period for our father. And I remember communicating with his physician at the time saying, is it possible to have some medication at home for him? And he said, oh, no, we don't do palliative care in Malaysia. So I remember being quite disappointed by that. And so that night he really started deteriorating, and my brother rang me, and he wasn't able to speak, my dad, but, that last stages of really quite a lot of struggle to breathe, and it was very distressing. And
were you able to talk to him on the phone?
Talk to him, yeah. I did.
Did you have FaceTime or something like that?
No, I couldn't FaceTime. I voice talked, but I told him how much he was loved and what a great job he'd done as a father, as a husband, and he was a real favorite with many people. So my cousins loved him, my cousins' children loved him. So what we did was basically I texted all these people and said, Papa's dying. You need to ring him so you can speak to him. So he had a waiting list of people speaking. I mean, I laugh because what a lovely way to go when you can't have anyone there with you except, my poor brother I felt really awful for him because it was a time where we needed to be together. I had an older brother in England who couldn't get there. I couldn't get there. My dad's best friend got to him and sat with him. But really, he died in the middle of the night on his own in that bed. And my brother had just gone to sleep for a few hours. And my carer was in the room, lying on the floor beside him and beside my mum, and he passed. And it was really awful not to be there to actually physically be with him. All those things you want to do. You want to touch the person. You want to see their eyes and give him a kiss.
With all that, the circumstances of his death, he didn't have you and he didn't have some of his other kids around him because of COVID. But he did die at home like he wanted.
Yeah.
He was able to look at your mum and look out the window, be in a house that was very familiar.
Yeah.
Everyone's calling him to say, I love you, and gets to say goodbye to him. But he's probably also still in a lot of pain because he's not getting palliative care.
Well, that's a problem. Yeah.
What do you think then about, does it make any sense to talk about a good death?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, a good death, taking in the circumstance of COVID, would have been that plus pain relief. And myself and Sri, his older son, being there. And I'm grateful that he was an anaesthetist and he knew he was going, and it was his choice to be at home. So my father was a brave, strong person, but it's still something that could have been avoided, I think, that struggle at the end. Because for someone to be there and watch their parent like that my younger brother had to, that was really hard as well.
So how did you become aware of West Australia's voluntary assisted dying scheme?
Being a GP, I don't know, I think a lot of other GPs would agree, but we're just bombarded with information every day. We're expected to know lots, actually, about lots of things, not a little about lots of things.
You mean like medical research?
The new drug for this, the new drug, everything goes in your pigeonhole, and, you're now expected to do this prostate thing and that, and it's a tremendous bombardment. And after my dad, I really struggled for those 2 years. I'd lost a lot of faith in, I think COVID in WA, we were so lucky, but it brought out the best in people, but it also brought out the worst in people. We had a lot of people around us saying, well, let's just stay shut forever because my granny lives down the road and I have my family. So it was...
Oh, that'd make you furious, wouldn't it?
Yeah. It was really difficult, really difficult. And I was seeing lots of actually migrant students who were really struggling, depression, anxiety. And as you know, our teenagers struggle anyway, far more than we ever did because of that horrendous thing called media. It has its pluses, but so I was really losing my mojo for work. Thinking, what's it all about? And so anyway, I went to my pigeonhole one day and I picked out this pamphlet and I said, VAD, what is that? And I brought it to our practice manager at the time. And every 2 weeks on a Tuesday, we have people come in and talk to us in the practice at lunchtime. And I said, would you do this? Because I don't think any of the others know much about this either. And one of the navigators, who is part of the VAD setup in WA.
What is a navigator?
They are an amazing bunch of people funded by the health department, and they do the amazing job. They're comprised of nurses, occupational therapists, social workers. Their backgrounds are all from that, and they take in the referrals. They field them out to us practitioners, who are the doctors who are doing it, and they support us, the patients, the carers, the families. They are the backbone.
So
of
they're
VAD.
navigators who find a way forward through this process, in other words.
Absolutely. They keep me in place every week. They're communicating with me through email and text saying, Mr. So-and-so's got through this phase. Do you now want to do this phase? But they also do tremendous support. So we got the chief navigator, the boss navigator, to come in and talk to us, Alice, on a Tuesday. And I remember sitting there thinking, wow, this is amazing. I didn't actually, I didn't put it together with Dan and my dad. And, I just thought, I've always loved palliative care as well. I did a lot of home visits in Bunbury when I was there for the 10 years and in Ireland. And I enjoyed that connection, which is what we've lost in GP now. We've lost the connection. Because it's 15 minutes, it's a shopping list, and it's the only way to actually make a living, which is so sad. So Alice was an amazing speaker, and she told us about a few experiences, and I went up to her afterwards, and it went from there, really.
How does the scheme work in WA? What's the eligibility criteria for you to be admitted to this process of voluntary assisted dying?
So the eligibility, and it's similar in every state, and we have it in all states except Northern Territory at the moment, VAD. You have to be over 18. You have to be a citizen or a permanent resident. So we have to see proof of that. You have to have a disease that's going to end your life in the short future, basically. So it's under 6 months prognosis or under 12 months if it's a neurodegenerative disease. You have to have capacity to consent for VAD. And we also assess that there's no coercion going on, that it's your own choice. And that request for VAD has to be enduring throughout the assessment process.
Assessing for coercion must be tricky.
It is very tricky.
It must be very tricky because that's always one of the concerns expressed by about euthanasia laws, which is a different thing. I know it's a slightly different thing.
Absolutely.
Is that it's easy to make an old person feel unwanted and what are you still doing on the planet?
Yes.
So then once the person qualifies for this, becomes eligible because they have a short-term prognosis, they have a terminal illness and they have the capacity, what happens then? How does the process proceed from there?
Well, the process actually takes 2 to 3 weeks. And that's the reason why, people need to know more about this, because our biggest heartbreak is having patients or family ring us in their last week of life, and we just don't get through the process for them, So I would go out as what we call the coordinating practitioner. I would meet with the family and the patient, and we talk about their illness. We talk about their expectations and what they want from VAD. And it's a very emotive talk, as you can imagine. You've got to be comfortable talking about death. Patients are all different. We've all got different families. And then if we find them eligible, and sometimes that means going away and getting more clinical information from specialists, etc., we then refer to another practitioner. And
for a second opinion.
Yes, absolutely. I explain this to my patients, phrases like, that's not to check up on you, it's to check up on me, that I'm doing the right thing by ticking the boxes for you, that legally that I'm doing the right thing. So the second practitioner needs to then assess them. And all this takes time, obviously, because we've all got other jobs. So I'm a GP. I probably do quite a lot of that. I'm a GP 1 day of the week, but a lot of my colleagues are anaesthetists, palliative care consultants, emergency doctors. So the second practitioner assesses them for the same eligibility criteria and then says yes or no. And then we proceed on to, generally what I do is you have to have a face-to-face conversation then, because often the first two can be on video conference because WA is a large state and we often can't get to patients to do a lot of the assessments. But the third one has to be face-to-face legally.
Now, when you have that face-to-face conversation, that must be quite a fraught conversation. Do you have to sort of take a bit of a deep intake of breath before you walk into that room?
I don't find that I have to do it anymore. I think, the whole thing about having built up some kind of relationship with the patient at that first assessment is important. I tend to get an idea of how this patient wants to talk about death. I had a patient who said to me, "Oh, stop calling it passing away, Boo, I'm dying." So I said, "Okay, I'll call it dying." People are different, so you assess all that. You also assess the family dynamics, which is so important. Families are wonderful things, but they're also full of history and...
Yes, so do you have that conversation with the patient,
yes,
with the family not in the room at the same time?
Yes, and I often get very helpful family trying to respond to questions, and I kind of have to say politely, "I actually need to hear this from so-and-so's mouths, if that's okay." And we go from that. But
so do you have to get the family out of the room?
No, I don't. Richard, the only time I get families out of the room is at that final administration day, because I really like to have a chat with the patient, very short chat, because they're really ready by then and they're champing at the bit. But I really then say to them, "Do you want this, and is this your own decision?"
Do you have a conversation then about the circumstances of how the patient
Absolutely.
wants the death to proceed?
Yeah. So that third visit, I often say to patients, after the second doctor has seen you, and if he or she finds you eligible, I will come back and we will have the conversation about when, where, if, and how. And that's the simplest way to put it. And we talk about all that. We talk about, have you got a date set in mind? Where would you like to be? If you'd like to be at home, would you like to be in your room or on the patio or under your favorite tree? How? There's oral or intravenous options. And if, because 30% of VAD patients who are found eligible never end up using it.
Oh, really? So patients change their mind?
Yes, patients can change their mind, but I think one of the biggest, and I wouldn't know the stats for this, I'm not a big numbers person, but one of the reasons why sometimes people don't use it is because of loss of capacity. Because right till the very end, they do need capacity. So if you've got confusion, maybe you've got metastatic brain cancer, things can change for the patient. So we do prepare them for that right from that first visit and say, when you're assessing time, and that's where I think a lot of the public are not aware that you do need capacity, at that moment, even if it's a signal by squeezing a hand or blinking, because with things like motor neuron disease, that is all the patient is able to do sometimes.
So when the day comes, what is that like for the patient? What happens on that day?
I've often wondered, actually, the night before I'm about to go and attend an admin, as I call it, I often go to sleep thinking, what is so-and-so thinking tonight? I wonder what it must be like. And then when I turn up, and I always have a wonderful navigator with me to support each other, it's often, especially when they're older, it's often a place of laughter and celebration.
Really?
Not always, but yes. The patient themselves often is so ready on that day. It's like it's what they've been waiting for is for their family to get to that readiness. Of course, it can be a very much different atmosphere, especially with younger people, because you're never ready to let your loved ones go. I'm not saying that you're more ready when they've lived a full life. Possibly, but when it's a young person, it's a different matter.
There's often a thing called a living wake. How does that work?
So we've come to hear about living wakes. People seem to do this in different ways. So what the patients have said to me was, when I've done that third visit and I go away to write the prescription and I say, you just give us a ring when and if and, and then I'll say to them, what are you doing in the next if they've set a date, what are you doing in the next few weeks? And often they will say, well, I'm getting all my family together and we're going to have a party or we're going to have a celebration. So, it's ranged from a few people having a celebratory dinner to a large gathering in a Margaret River winery to celebrate the life of a person, except the person's still there. It's wonderful. People tell me when I go for the admin day, things like, I never knew so many people liked me or loved me. Obviously, family, but all these people who have come back into my life. We see beautiful moments like I've had a 17-year-old make contact with his father again, and he was then actually there for his admin. Estrangement happens in families, as you know, and friends. And it fixes things, because nothing is more important than love, really. So people realize that this person's not going to be here next week. This is what is important. So they're amazing things, I think.
Are they joyous, raucous, like an Irish wake, but except the dead person's still alive?
Yes, I've never been to one that I've been invited to because I've just felt that's not my place, but thank you very much and I really appreciate it. But the navigator and I have walked into a few when they've chosen to have it on that day. So recently we went to a beautiful admin where she was a gorgeous woman, actually, and she had her three grown-up sons there and their partners and a few good friends. And we walked into a room full of light. She wanted to die on her patio where she fed the magpies every day and look out on the trees that she'd grown as saplings. She was in her 80s. And there was an amazing playlist on, and there was a big table spread, a great spread out with nibbles and cheese, and everyone had a glass of champagne in their hands, including herself, and she was smoking, well, I think it was a cigarette.
Why not?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was, she was, and she had the most amazing death, and we couldn't quite get her out on the patio because it was raining, it was drizzling, but we opened the French doors and her two big, strong sons moved the sofa out so that she was right on the edge. And as she said, her baby son sat beside her, who was like in his 40s, and the other two sat on the other side, and I knelt behind her, and she had all the women in front of her and her best friend, and the magpies came to say goodbye. And she sat there and she was so ready, and I asked her the questions I do, and she said, I get various answers. I sometimes say, just get on with it, boo, or yes, I'm ready. It was just such a wonderful passing because she said at some stage, just as she was falling asleep, because the thing with VAD is it's peaceful, it's calm, it's falling asleep. And just as she fell asleep, she mumbled something, and one of her sons said, "What did you say, Mum?" And the other son said, "I think she said to the lady standing in front of her, 'Get out of the way, you're ruining my view.'" And she put her head on her baby son's shoulder and she fell asleep.
And died.
And died.
I don't know how spiritually inclined you are, but what do you think happens in that moment when life leaves a person?
I'm hugely spiritually inclined. I'm an agnostic because I think of all the different religions I've been exposed to, but I really feel that there's something there that we can't explain. I often see death as this thing that you can walk people up to the shore and then they have to make that journey out to the horizon on their own. And for me, I see that VAD gives them, they either have to swim or get in a little boat. I mean, this is what I feel. I think it helps me. But that last bit the waters can be choppy and dark. And if you're in WA, there can be sharks out there. And what VAD does is it makes it that beautiful Cottesloe water that day. And they can swim out and leave their loved ones for that last bit where they get to the horizon. And there's this amazing big, I always picture it as a really big ship like the Lewin or something. And on it are the people that have gone before you. saying, come on, give me your hand.
I'm really hearing feeling in your voice and emotion in your voice. Do you feel that feeling? Do you feel emotional in every one of these events? Is that the word for it? These deaths that you
Absolutely. I mean, I think you'd be, hard pressed to be doing this if you don't have emotion, because the conversations you have are full of emotion. We have talks about, and the day of admin can be. We've had grandchildren snuggled up on the bed, pets on the bed.
Why is it called admin? Admin seems like a terrible
I know, we talk about
word.
it admin between ourselves because it's administration of the medication. Yeah, because what else do you call it? For our point of view, we call it the admin day. I would talk to patients about the day I come to you to give you your medication, but between ourselves, we call it the admin day. And yes, it's incredibly moving. But when I leave, I have a thing. We all have different ways of dealing with it. I have a colleague who collects the padlocks that come on our drug thing. I have a colleague who likes to get into water afterwards, so anywhere that's swimmable. In WA, we have lots of options. And for me, I take my shoes off before I give the medication because it humbles me and it grounds me and we're on equal footing. And so I put my shoes on afterwards and I leave. And I remember everything that's good in my life.
What do you want for yourself, for your own
I want
moment?
that.
You want that?
Yeah, I do want that. I want peace and quiet. I want my loved ones. Because this, the other thing is that, I learned so much from this, that material stuff just does not matter at the end. Nobody's lain there and told me what their job has earned them and how famous they've been or that they've got this car, and all they've wanted is love. So it really reminds you of what you want at the last bit. So I want love around me. I love the people I love, and I love being loved. But I would love to be also under a tree looking up at the branches and just drifting away and swimming that Cottesloe water.
Bhawani, what an amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Richard.
Dr. Bhawani O'Brien is a practitioner of voluntary assisted dying in WA.
This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app. Or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
Today's conversation with Dr. Bhawani O'Brien was produced on the lands of the Gadigal people. Producer is Maggie Morris. Executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.